actually gonna use my notes. Okay, so
Actually, let me check the second
yeah.
presentation just to see.
Oh yeah, cause the paper something.
Yeah, no, it's because if it's remote, they've got a recording
Mm,
in the PowerPoint.
yeah, awesome. Should I just start?
No, no, we'll wait until
Okay.
25. Yeah, and I'll make a little
Okay.
joke and then we'll start. Okay, do we have anyone from our second or fifth papers who are here? Detecting disparities in police deployments or cross-institutional transfer learning for educational models? Oh, that's yours. Fourth one's yours. Measuring and mitigating voting across disparities? That's yours. Bias against 93 stigmatized groups? Okay, yes. Okay. We're going to get started in about a minute or two. Okay, so you're going fifth. Or a PowerPoint. Excellent.
Yeah, is it PowerPoint?
That's yours?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so you'll just go to Okay, hello and welcome. My name is Stuart Geiger, and I am your safari guide on this tour of Measurement in the Wild. I'll just give a couple housekeeping notes for this. We have a very short amount of time. We have 1 hour for 5 papers, so all authors or presenters are requested to only take 10 minutes. We will be doing Q&A at the very end. If you're on Hopin, you can use the Q&A tab on Hopin to make that. And we might stay about 5 minutes extra, taking some of your 20-minute break after this to make sure we have full Q&A. But if you need to leave at the end for the next session to set up, that's perfectly okay. And so with this, I want to introduce our first speaker, who will be talking about algorithms as social, ecological, technological systems, and environmental justice lens on algorithmic audits.
Great. Thank you so much, Stuart. And thanks, everyone. So, thank you. Yeah, this is joint work with Roel Daub out of Delft University in the Netherlands. And I'm excited to share with you, and I'm a Senior Trustworthy AI Fellow at the Mozilla Foundation. So a growing body of work across interdisciplinary fields has engaged with algorithmic auditing and impact assessments as a mechanism for algorithmic evaluation and accountability. And building on this work, we aim to bring in perspectives from the field of environmental justice. Environmental justice scholarship and grassroots communities have been leading actors in addressing harms to marginalized communities and the environment, and their struggles span over a longer time horizon and have led to effective strategies for more comprehensive, integral, and inclusive actions in response to environmental injustice. For example, consider the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, which has been recognized as the worst example of environmental injustice in recent US history. Algorithmic models have been proposed to assess the risk of lead contamination of the water infrastructure in individual homes and neighborhoods. And to train the models, they've utilized voluntary residential water tests, historical records, and city infrastructure data. From an environmental justice perspective, it becomes critical to address the sampling bias of volunteer residential testing, as well as residents' differential access to the estimations made by the model. Low-income communities that don't have internet connection may inevitably not have access to vital data about the risks of lead contamination in their household. AI systems are infrastructure ontologically distinct from social, ecological, technological systems. What we mean by that is that they are dependent on social and ecological resources to be built, used, and maintained. They also contribute to carbon and ecological costs through their dependency on computational infrastructure and their role in fossil fuel production. And lastly, any problem that is solved through AI has underlying technical, social, and institutional components that their interactions and infrastructures depend on and impact other socio-ecological technological systems. So this so-called SETS approach is centered on investigating the couplings or relationships between social, ecological, and technological dimensions of a system. And ecological justice scholar Melissa Pinanda-Pinto and her collaborators here define these through this diagram where you see socio-ecological relationships referring to human nature and social-ecological relationships, feedbacks, and interactions that impact human well-being and ecosystem services. Then we have social technological couplings, refer to the ways in which technology and human social systems interact. And lastly, we have ecological technological relationships, which refer to the different ways in which climate and biophysical systems impact technology and vice versa, such as, for example, wildfires, which cause power outages or raising temperatures, driving increased energy use for cooling technology in buildings and data centers, which in turn contribute to the urban heat island. We've seen investigations of the ecological technological couplings in the context of AI systems in terms of awareness and investigations of the environmental impact of machine learning models and their underlying computational infrastructure. So for example, Emma Strubel et al. Estimate the environmental costs of large language models, and other scholars propose policy recommendations on how to reduce it, and initiatives like Green AI, Green Deep Learning, and online tools aim to shift existing norms in AI development by advocating for the reporting of carbon footprint alongside accuracy and other efficiency metrics in AI. We've also seen prior work on the socio-technical considerations of large language models. For example, Emily Bender et al. Call for the considerations of how risks and benefits of LLMs are distributed, leveraging the literature on environmental justice and environmental racism. And furthermore, scholars discuss how could computing companies, data centers, Amazon in particular, contribute to indirect environmental harms through contracts with oil and gas industry, as well as donations to political candidates denying climate change. And lastly, we've seen much less attention in the area of socio-ecological considerations of LLMs. And in an effort to bring in a broader set of questions on that and how we conceptualize and study and measure sustainability, justice, and socio-ecological impact of LLMs, our theory of change is centered on the need and utility of sets analysis to enable interdisciplinary collaboration in algorithmic auditing. And in particular, we bring in learnings from the field of environmental justice and what's called just sustainability paradigm, which refers to the equity deficit in environmental sustainability scholarship and practice, and challenges these discourses to be accountable for justice and equity. And you see here the annual review of environmental justice, one of the most recent annual reviews, which has been from a few years back already. But in that review, Julian Agman et al. Framed 3 central approaches in recent environmental justice practice and scholarship. And we see interesting mapping between them and work that has already been tremendously discussed within the FACT community, which is why really we hope to kind of bring lessons, right, from environmental justice to contribute to conversations that are happening here already. So first, Julian Agman et al. Identify focus on the practices and materiality of everyday life in the way that we provide for basic human needs. For example, access to water, food, energy, while also restructuring the unsustainable material flows that contribute to inequities with regards to access and security and sovereignty to such resources on local, national, and global scales. Next, environmental justice considers spatial and cultural dimensions of impact. Major issues here are related to the interdependencies between justice, identity, community, space, place, and agency. For example, linking to critiquing the problems of gentrification, the displacement, homelessness, and others. And lastly, a key issue in environmental justice encompasses the environmental degradation of ecosystems, leading to increased vulnerabilities for the human and non-human inhabitants. Overlaying these key themes in environmental justice scholarship and this socio-ecological technical systems analysis, we propose a qualitative framework of questions, which we hope could be implemented and contribute to existing algorithmic auditing processes. So for example, within the practice and materiality of resource flows dimensions, along the life cycle of an algorithmic systems, practitioners need to consider questions as, for example, what is the infrastructure, right? Computational infrastructure, from mineral extractivism to data centers and infrastructures to electronic waste dumps, as well as how might the outcomes of the algorithmic model impact the way people interact with ecosystem services, such as access to water, food, and energy. So through a SETS lens, we call for moving away from narrow and closed risk-based approaches to impact assessment towards a broad and open framing, such as participatory and deliberative mapping. Within environmental justice, we've also seen a growing number of community-led initiatives examining how environmental data about harms and injustices moves between communities and policymakers. And similarly, we call for prototyping mechanisms for reporting of algorithmic incidents, controversies, or injustice experienced by unintended and intended users of AI, and considering how such mechanisms are affected by and may contribute to existing power structures, and finally, the role of workers in a growing number of calls for solidarity. So what it would look like for policymakers and AI developers to enable local communities where the technology is deployed to evolve their own tools and processes for algorithmic auditing. And with that, we also want to invite you to join a working group that has been running for at least half a year already, and is further discussing these questions at the intersection of the conversation at FACT with bringing in lessons from environmental justice. And I encourage you to read the paper as well. Thank you.
Okay, do we have the author? Yes, our second paper. All right, our second paper will be on detecting disparities in police deployments using dashcam data.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Matt Franchi, and I'm here to talk about how we detected disparities in police deployments using dashcam data. I'll skip this and put it back up at the end just for brevity. Sweet. So to begin, there's significant work utilizing large-scale policing data to evaluate departments' efficiency and equity. Interestingly, this work primarily focuses on the events unfolding after police are deployed, the so-called downstream outcomes, rather than where the police originally go. Downstream outcomes include disparities in arrests, police stops across racial groups, differences in police search practices, and the respect demonstrated by officers to drivers of different races. Police deployments influence all of these. For example, it's more likely that you're going to be arrested for a crime if there are more police deployed in your neighborhood. This point is brought up in Lemon-Isaacs to Predict and Serve, which postulates a feedback loop where neighborhoods with heavier police deployments have higher arrest rates for the same crime rates, producing bias in algorithms trained on arrest data. Policing disparities analysis extends beyond the academic world, encompassing journalists, activists, and legal experts. However, despite this coverage, a significant gap persists. It's often quite hard to get deployment data in the United States, and the significance of this data is twofold. Firstly, statistical scrutiny of deployments can expose systemic inefficiencies and inequities, highlighting areas with a disproportionate police presence. Second, as we touched on earlier, any disparity in police deployments can lead to biases in downstream outcomes, impacting wider law enforcement results. So responding to this call for transparent auditing of police deployments, we propose and implement a unique solution, employing dashcam images from public street scenes to detect police vehicles. This new approach allows us to monitor police deployments effectively and transparently, offering a fresh lens to understand and address policing disparities. To execute our methodology, we harness a dataset of roughly 25 million geo and temporally annotated dashcam images, captured from public street scenes throughout New York City during 2020. From this set, we handpicked 9,500 images for training our model, annotating them based on the presence or absence of police vehicles. For machine learning, we deploy a You Only Look Once, dubbed YOLO-based deep learning model, which showed high proficiency in identifying police vehicles. Our data comes from Nexar, a firm that provides ride-sharing drivers with dashboard cameras covering all 5 boroughs of New York City. However, this does not equate to a completely random roadside sample of the city. Consequently, we've put sizable measures in place to neutralize dataset biases. Primarily, we re-rated the image distribution to match the population distribution of New York City. To put into context, when calculating the police deployment levels that Asian residents encounter, we adjust our data sample to oversample areas with larger Asian communities. We also account for imperfect classification performance in our estimates and explicitly test for unequal performance across subpopulations, finding consistent performance. Now let's take a look at the classifier. When we set our positive classification threshold at 0.77, which was identified as optimal, we identified 233,000 images with the police vehicle out of about 25 million. The figure to the right offers a glimpse at a few of these positive detections. As you can see, the model handles challenging situations like occluded or small pixel-sized vehicles with reasonable accuracy. Here, you can see how our model performs across various subgroups, as mentioned earlier. The key thing to note is the gap between the orange and blue dots. If it's smaller than the line length indicating uncertainty, we can't say there's a statistically significant difference in model performance across that subgroup. Further, we cross-reference police detections with external data to check for anticipated correlations. We found that areas with images on closer on average to crime incidents or police stations were indeed more likely to have police vehicles detected. We confirmed these relationships with a Pearson correlation across census block groups, giving us a p-value less than 0.001. This extra validation step gives us confidence that our model doesn't just perform well, but it also aligns with the relationships we'd predict between police activity, crime incidents, and proximity to police stations. So on to results. We've based our analysis on a central metric, the likelihood that members of a certain group, say white residents, will spot a police vehicle when they're out on a street in their home neighborhood. This measure syncs well with the street-level perspective offered by our data set, and here we emphasize visual depictions of our results with much more precision being available in the paper. We limit analysis to an October-November 2020 partition of the data set, as temporal and geospatial coverage as well as density are highest during this period. So, We're assessing variations in police deployments by groupings like race, type of zone, population density, median household income, borough, and neighborhood. Let's start with spatial disparities. This figure gives you a citywide overview of police deployment rates broken down by neighborhood tabulation areas. From this map, you can clearly see a wide range in deployment rates, a near 20-fold difference between the highest and lowest neighborhoods, Gramercy and Arden Heights, Rossville. This bar graph brings into closer focus the relative police deployment levels across different neighborhoods. This might not be super impactful if you're not familiar with New York neighborhoods, but a couple of patterns emerge when we look at the top 12. We see some of the wealthiest areas of the city, like Hudson Yards, dubbed by the New York Times as a billionaire's fantasy city, and some of the most heavily policed, such as Rikers Island, which is home to a large and infamous prison complex. We should also consider that certain unique characteristics of a neighborhood could influence high deployment levels. For example, Gramercy idiosyncratically has a major police training center located on 2 thoroughfares. So to dig deeper into these spatial disparities, we're going to explore correlations with zone type and population density. Looking at these figures, we see that commercial zones experience significantly higher police deployments, nearly double the city average compared to residential and manufacturing zones. Adding population density into the mix reveals more insights. The box plots show a clear trend. As population density increases, so does police deployment. This data suggests that areas with high police deployment levels are often densely populated commercial regions like downtown Manhattan. Shifting focus to demographic and economic indicators, we assess police deployment patterns in relation to racial groupings and median household income. Notably, we zero in on residential zones to best reflect where people actually live. The left plot shows marked racial disparities in police deployment. Within the distribution, there's a 34% discrepancy between the groups experiencing the most and least police presence. This plot also echoes earlier observed trends in New York City, where Black and Hispanic communities faced heavier policing. In the right plot, we stratify by income quartile, revealing a trend where police deployments escalate as median household income diminishes. As an aside, we do report these results by individually stratifying each variable. We do acknowledge that multiple causal mechanisms might underlie them. In synthesizing our analysis, we find that police deployment in New York paints a multi-layered and intricate portrait. Clear spatial disparities exist, with some neighborhoods experiencing significantly higher police vehicle deployments than others. Residential zones with higher populations of Black, Hispanic, or lower income residents notably experience elevated levels of police presence. Adding another layer of complexity, we find that affluent and dense commercial districts like Hudson Yards witness an increased police presence. This correlates with established research suggesting a correlation between gentrification and heightened police visibility. So while our study offers valuable insights, it's important to acknowledge limitations. First, police vehicles are a partial proxy for policing activity. Aspects like officers on foot, unmarked cars, and recent tenets for subway policing remain out of reach of dashcam. Secondly, the sampling within each census area may have its own biases. For instance, roadways with protest activity during the George Floyd demonstrations in New York were sometimes barred off, which would obviously affect the reach of dashcam cameras. Also, it's essential to consider the social dynamics during the pandemic period were extraordinary and definitely could have influenced our findings. Moreover, the sample collection process from Nexar remains opaque, leaving room for unknown biases. Nevertheless, we believe our study provides a strong foundation and insights for future research in this domain. Our methods are an effective yet impractical solution for members of the public wanting to monitor police activity. This underlines the importance of police departments releasing this data at the source. The potential of dashcam data extends far beyond police audits. It holds great promise for auditing other government services and agencies for efficiency and equity. It also adds to the growing body of work in computational social science. Looking ahead, we're keen to expand our scope. Given more data, we could examine variation in police deployment over more recent and longer periods. Beyond policing, we could use dashcam images to audit other aspects of urban life, like tracking street-side garbage for environmental assessments or evaluating accessibility for older adults. I'd like to end by expressing my gratitude for your attention. We're looking forward to taking these insights and using them to drive further research and ultimately create more equitable cities. Thank you.
If I could have our third presenter join us. So on this grand tour of measurement in the wild, we are moving from environmental to policing to voting. And so our next paper is on measuring and mitigating voting access disparities, a study of race and polling locations in Florida and North Carolina.
Great, thanks. Hi, folks. I'm Sorrel Friedler. This is joint work with Mohsen Abbasi, Calvin Barrett, Christian Lum, who's in the audience, and you should also feel free to bug, and Suresh Venkata-Subramanian. So we were really interested in trying to understand, given the long history of voter suppression in the US, and especially suppression of the black vote in the US, what that looked like now, and how we could try to actually measure potential disparities in access to vote, right? So right around the 2020 election, there was a lot of concern, especially about voter suppression through essentially the indirect means of creating long wait times at the polls. So that received a lot of press and attention, and we were interested in trying to figure out what are some ways of quantifying that. How can we and should we measure voters' access to their polling location, and how does this access differ by race? So in the paper, we focus on essentially two approaches to trying to do that measurement. One is distance to the polls, and the other is the number of people assigned to each location. That number of people assigned to each location is sort of our not super great, but maybe acceptable proxy for that wait time. And we discuss that more in the paper and the pretty extensive limitations of that particular approach. For this talk, I want to focus on distance to the polls. So specific to distance to the polls, there's a long line of research on this, especially from political science, that aims to measure especially how somebody's distance to their polling location impacts the likelihood that they're actually going to show up at their polling location and vote. And the general trend across that research is that it says that distance does matter, right? And that, you know, as you get further from your polling location, you're less likely to show up. But there are a lot of caveats because of the various methodologies that are used in these papers. You know, so they really started in the early 2000s, and at that time they were pretty small studies, right? Sort of county level studies. And you know, as the studies got bigger, they used these sort of interesting methodological tricks, like looking at precinct boundaries and looking at people who might be on opposite sides of the same street but assigned to different polling locations, right? That presents sort of a nice study opportunity and allows them to scale up to, you know, a statewide study. But it doesn't really allow them to capture the experience of all voters, right? Because not all voters live on the boundary of precincts. So there are some sort of interesting caveats to this work, and one of the other things that keeps appearing in this work is that in fact, it's not quite clean that as you get further from the polling location, you're less likely to show up because, of course, urban residents have really different experiences than suburban residents. And so there's lots of sort of confounding variables based on vehicle access, based on population density, right? So the studies are complex, and trying to get a clean answer is a little tricky. So that's sort of the landscape we were entering. So what we decided to do was study the US 2020 general election, and we looked at all registered voters in Florida and North Carolina. We chose Florida and North Carolina largely for data access reasons. Those are states where you can get the voting rolls, right, the list of all registered voters, and they're states where those lists have information about race of the voters, right? So largely for that coincidence, but I also think it is useful to note that these are both states that have really contentious presidential elections, and they're also states with large non-white populations. So they also seem useful for the study in that context. So for each voter, we had information about race, address, the precinct, right, polling location they were assigned to, and then we also had information about whether they turned out to vote. And we were able to get latitude and longitude for each of those addresses, for each of the polling locations, and we also collected them for each school or library location in the state, which I will come back to in a minute why we needed that. We did all of that through ArcGIS. So the results, oh, and a side note, in the appendix of the paper, we also talk about sort of missing data analysis, and the sort of short version of that is that we don't actually think that it biased our analysis in any way. So if we look at the raw results of these measurements by race, these are the numbers that we get. And what you'll see is that in both states, in general, white voters were further from the polling location. But this is not yet normalized based on population density, right? So it might be that the effect that we're seeing is really that there are more white voters in rural areas where we might expect the distance to the polling location to be further, and more non-white voters in urban locations where we might expect the distance to be shorter, right? So this is just sort of an initial look at the data. And then the large question we had was, right, how do we do this normalization? How do we understand these trends at a statewide level? If we look at, again, just these raw distance locations as compared to turnout, what we find, which is, again, this sort of counterintuitive finding, is that as somebody's distance to their polling location increases, the likelihood that they show up to vote also increases, which is strange, right? You have to go further to get to your polling location, you're more likely to go there. That doesn't seem quite right. But again, right, this is this sort of issue of all of these confounding variables and population density. Okay, so what are we gonna do about that? So we looked into a bunch of different ways of trying to normalize that distance to get to something that would actually allow us to make sense across different types of population centers. And so we tried a couple of different normalization techniques. One was normalizing by your distance to the closest near voter, right? Essentially trying to directly normalize based on population density. That turns out to have some strange effects because of, for example, apartment buildings where the distance to your closest voter is 0. So, you know, you can see the results there, but we think that that's maybe not the best measurement. What did end up working much better is normalizing by distance to your nearest school or library as sort of a proxy for distance that you might be expected to normally be able to travel, right? Sort of a reasonable distance to travel on a daily basis. And so what you can see is that, oh, and we also tried both the mean and median, and for the usual reasons, the median sort of makes more sense. And so what you can see is that the non-white voters in Florida have to travel further to the polls under this normalized distance. So you can think of a normalized distance of 1 here as being your distance to your nearest school or library. So white voters had to travel in Florida a normalized distance of 1.09, whereas, for example, Hispanic voters had to travel 1.26, a normalized distance. In North Carolina, on the other hand, these were fairly equalized and largely pretty close to 1. And in fact, in North Carolina, if you look at the data, a lot of the polling locations are someone's nearest school or library, right? And that seems to sort of functionally be having the effect that it's a little bit closer to being equalized by race. And if you then do that same sort of study that we'd done earlier about looking at, you know, what does this mean for voting rate, you find finally sort of the expected trend from the literature, which is that as this normalized distance increases, the voting rate goes down, right? So as voters have to travel, say, 2 times as their closest school or library, they become less likely to vote. We also looked at what we could do about that, right? Is it possible to allocate polling locations in a way that is more fair? And so, you know, details of this are in the paper, but we looked at fair versions of K-median, fair versions of K-center, and looked at, you know, how to allocate if you were given, say, school or library locations, right? How could you better allocate the same number of polling locations so that everyone has a shorter distance to travel? And it turns out that that is, in fact, possible. But again, I'll leave the details to the paper. Thanks.
All right. So for our, let me just pull this up. For our, no, that's not the right. Okay, so we move, if you look out to the left of your window, you will see a majestic educational system model, cross-institutional transfer learning for educational models, implications for model performance, fairness, and equity. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Stuart. Hi, everyone. I'm Ranjay. I'm assistant professor at Columbia University, and this work is jointly done. It's jointly done through a multi-institutional collaboration by Josh Gardner from University of Washington, Quan Wen from University of British Columbia, Chris Brooks from University of Michigan, and Renee Kizelchuk from Cornell University. The starting point of this paper is that nowadays algorithm decision making has been more and more prevalent in a lot of, especially social sectors that concern people's everyday life. And institutions train machine learning models to do some predictions, and then you based on the predictions to make some further decisions. And as we know, for machine learning models, sometimes it might be good to have more diverse data to have more better representation of the data so that we can improve performance and robustness of models. And it's technically feasible, if you're thinking about this kind of issue in the same domain where different institutions and they face similar problems, they face similar data, they make similar decisions. So technically, it might be desirable to say that, okay, we can combine different institutions' data, to improve the model. But realistically, it's a lot of times not feasible due to privacy constraints or policy concerns. That's not really a feasible thing in the field, especially in some more sensitive fields like medical, educational, or those kind of areas. So one possible solutions that people have been talking about is more like sometimes you can keep the data in place in individual institutions, but instead you can play with the models and play with communicate. Basically, different institutions can communicate the models, the different parameters of the model, different attributes of models, so that you can still benefit from this kind of more diverse information across different institutions. And sometimes it's more formalized as a federated learning, but sometimes it doesn't have to be that way. Can be variants of that when resources are limited. But basically, you can think about different approaches to communicate the models across institutions when different institutions face similar problems. So there has been machine learning technical literature on this, but the empirical implications of these kind of paradigms, especially in relation to fairness, because you can think that even in the same field, different institutions might have different types of people and that kind of thing. And what it means for fairness, there's not as much literature on it. So our work is basically taking this first step. So this is an initial step of our ongoing project. We're trying to provide some empirical evidence on this issue in the domain of education. So overall, this paradigm we refer to as cross-institutional transfer learning in our paper. And so we specifically address 3 research questions in this paper. One is, how does this cross-institutional transfer affect overall performance related to think about a local model, which refers to where each individual institution takes their data, trains their own model for certain predictive decision making. And the second question is related to how this paradigm affect the intersectional fairness of the resulting model. And the third question is to look at whether there's a trade-off between model performance and fairness. So this talk will mostly focus on the results of the first 2 questions, the overall performance and intersectional fairness. So we specifically focus on one task in educational setting, which is higher education dropout prediction. This is an important task because at least in the US and in some other countries as well, retention of college freshmen is a huge issue. There are people dropping out of college, and universities are making a lot of efforts to keep these students on track, graduate on time, and things like that. And identifying who might run the risk of dropping out, especially early in the stage, is crucial for various stakeholders in the educational system. So we're doing this very typical kind of dropout prediction task across 4 different institutions. So there's a table with demographic composition of the 4 institutions. They're all 4-year institutions, but their demographics are very different, like their enrollment size and even their modality, one of them being the fully online university. So there are 4 very different institutions. And we're trying to say, okay, if we do this kind of cross-institutional transfer learning on this dropout prediction across these 4 very different institutions, what the results would look like. And in the limited sense, for this paper, we only assume there's a single round of kind of model communication between institutions. And the specific task is to use a large set of what we call administrative data about individual students early on in their experience to predict their dropout at the end of the first year. And all of these predictors or the features are chosen among those that every single institution has to report to the federal agency. So we're not using super like institution-specific predictors. So this is a very common set of predictors. So we did we did multiple experiments. We vary three main factors. We vary functional form. We vary the transfer strategy, the communication strategy. We also vary, when it comes to a stacking strategy that I'll mention later, what's the specific strategy for that stacking. But in this talk, I'll focus on the results across different kind of transfer types of transfer strategies. And all the results are based on gradient boosted trees because across all the experiments, it's the best performing, and we found similar patterns for other algorithms. So, thinking about this kind of overall transfer, cross-institutional transfer learning, there are different variants of model communication across institutions, and we specifically look at 4 strategies. One is more like a baseline strategy where there's no model communication. Every institution takes their own data, train their own model, and evaluate on their own. And by the way, when we do this testing, when we do this evaluation, we use historical data to train the model, each institution's historical data to train the model, and predict the last year that we have the data for. And the data encompassed 9 years of students across all the institutions. And the second transfer strategy is what we call direct transfer, which is mostly each institution takes one external model from another institution. So without having their own data. So we assume this is applicable for example, they're low resource institutions. They don't have the capacity to develop their own model. So taking some external model might be a feasible solution to help them benefit from data-driven decision-making. An extension of this direct transfer is kind of the voting transfer, where each institution might take multiple models from several other institutions, and through a zero-shot voting strategy, we determine, through that voting strategy, we determine the final predictions for this kind of final target institution. And the final one is the most like complicated one, where we think that every institution has the capacity to develop their model, but we can still benefit from more diverse data. So each institution might have multiple models, but overall, but eventually each target institution will take their own data, but also will take multiple models from other institutions to take the predictive probabilities and append to their own data and train the model for their own. So we basically evaluate these 4 strategies, and so remember we have 4 institutions. We treat each institution as the target institution for evaluation. So we have a combination, have some combination of some results, but we'll visit the prediction results across all these 4 transfer strategies. For the overall performance, we actually surprisingly found that even though our 4 institutions are very different in terms of student composition, even the zero-shot voting transfer, without having any data from the local institution, in most cases they achieve similar performance to local models. We thought that you would see a lot of performance decrease, when the model was trained on a very different population, but it's not necessarily the case. And also, comparing the stack transfer strategy versus the zero-shot voting transfer, where the stack transfer is adding local data to a voting transfer. And comparing the two, the stack transfer doesn't really provide that much additional gain over local voting, over either a local model or voting transfer. So it doesn't provide much additional predictive value in terms of overall performance. And this additional graph only shows some, for each setting, we depict the difference between that setting to a local model, which is a baseline. So overall, there's not statistical significance in terms of their difference. And in terms of fairness, so here we focus on intersectional fairness, where we defined 4 intersectional groups based on student self-reported gender and race, not gender, sex and race. So there's a caveat here, like, because it's self-reporting and measured data, we don't take into account all the broader social constructs, that shape the notion, gender identity and racial identity. So that's a caveat. But here we're defining 4 intersectional groups, whether a student is underrepresented minority, and whether the student is a female student. In this graph, each point is the performance, which is AUC, for the specific group. And when you see this kind of length of the bar, it represents the difference across the group. So it's not surprising to see that there are performance difference across different intersectional groups. But surprisingly, we find that even though under each setting we would see this kind of performance disparity, we don't really find that this kind of zero-shot like transfer would incur more bias or incur larger kind of between group performance gaps. So on the right, the y-axis is the largest gap between the two, basically the length of the bar that you see on the left. So overall, in this initial work, we find that cross-institutional transfer can be as effective as local model training, even when no local training data is present. So this has very promising implication for low resource institutions, because those are the institutions that enroll the most students. And this transfer also, we don't find discernible impact on performance and fairness across intersectional subgroups. As a next step, we're working with more institutions, especially more less selective and institutions that enroll more students from underrepresented or disadvantaged backgrounds. And we're trying to improve this kind of, develop methods to improve this transfer adaptation, and also think about these privacy preserving issues in the context of this kind of model communication and sharing. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you all.
All right, thank you very much for that. All right, this is our final presentation. And we are going on this grand tour to the world of language models. And sorry, let's just get this set up. Where we'll be talking about, hearing about bias against 93 stigmatized groups in mass language models and downstream sentiment classification tasks. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin. I'm here today to present our paper on bias against 93 social stigmas. To begin, what is social stigma? I would go with the first definition coming from a social psychologist, Irving Goffman, who refers stigma as any socially devalued characteristics or attributes serving to reduce an individual from a whole and usual person to a tainted, discounted one. Definition of social stigma evolved in multiple social science disciplines over time. One thing to be clear is that social stigma are a little different from stereotypes. Stereotypes can be positive or negative, but social stigmas are often associated with negative stereotyping, labeling, and sometimes carry with discriminatory behaviors. So let's go into the motivation of this research. There has been a lot of great work that dedicated to bias evaluation in natural language processing. And this work heavily focuses on gender, race, and religion. There has been, however, this work has not, I would say there has been little attention paid to social stigma. If we take into all the social stigmatized condition into account, social stigma affects a substantial amount of population in the United States. Based on recent statistics, we see that there are 60% of adults experience chronic disease, 22% of the population experience mental illness, and 26% of the population experience one sort of a disability. So given the impact of social stigma, we dedicate our attention to evaluate bias associated with social stigmas in our study. So we look into 93 stigmatized groups, and these 93 stigmatized groups come from a psychology study by Pachankis et al., which is the first study that identified the extent of stigma against these groups in the United States. And these 93 stigmatized groups fall into multiple categories. Some of them actually fall into socioeconomic status, disease, mental illness, physical traits, and education, and drug use. And to compare, to evaluate whether there is this bias against these 92 stigmatized groups, we identified 29 non-stigmatized groups to conduct a comparative analysis. So prior studies in psychology measure the extent of stigma by measuring an interpersonal outcome called social rejection, which use the social distance scale. The social distance scale consists of 7 questions that related to social interactions, which aims to evaluate individuals' willingness to interact with individuals with stigmatized conditions. Building on top of these kind of questions, we experiment with mass language models. Mass language models are pre-trained with an objective to fill in words in mass for sentences. So in this case, we have the sentence, I think facts is a blank conference, and mass language models are able to fill in the words as suitable to the context. So building on top of the social distance questions that we convert these questions into statements in which there's one word missing for the mass language model to predict which try to indicate whether there's approval or disapproval of the social context in the sentence. Due to the variation effect on mass language model prediction, we curated 4 prompt templates in our experiments. So you can see here, each prompt consisted of 1 prompt template and also 1 stigmatized or non-stigmatized condition. And then we collect the top 50 predictions from mass language models and annotate it based on whether they are neutral, positive, or negative, or irrelevant based on the context. Filtering out the words that are irrelevant, we aggregated the probability of words based on their annotated category to infer the proportion of negative words being predicted associated with each condition for each prompt. So remember that the social distance scale has 7 questions such that we have 7 prompts, and each of them has a probability of negative words. And we aggregated all of these 7 probability of negative words to measure the probability of negative attitudes for each condition. So the result indicates that across different prompt templates and the 6 mass language models we have chosen, that mass language models tend to predict more negative words when prompt templates are filled with stigmatized conditions compared to prompts when they are filled with non-stigmatized conditions. If we break these conditions into category, we can identify that mass language models are more likely to predict negative words for prompts that include stigmatized conditions associated with physical traits, mental illness, drug use, disability, and disease. So next, we look into sentiment classification. Sentiment classification is one of the most popular downstream tasks of language models. It's commonly used for content moderation and market research. Sentiment classification is usually used to automatically identify whether a tweet or product review is talking positively, negatively, or neutral about something. So for example, in this sentence, I think facts is a wonderful conference indicates a positive sentiment of the sentence, and using one of the sentiment classifier we used in our experiment, it indicates indeed is a positive sentiment. However, the next example, I would like to invite everyone in the audience to think about what should be the sentiment of this sentence convey. And the result of one of the sentiment classifier indicates that this sentence convey a negative sentiment. To investigate further, we replaced the sentences that use a similar sentence prompt template and then replace the word disabilities with other stigmatized or non-stigmatized conditions to curate sentences and then pass these sentences into the 4 sentiment classifiers in our experiments. These sentiment classifiers are trained based on the mass language models that we evaluated earlier, but they're all trained with different diverse data sets. So aggregating all the sentiment classification results from all these 4 sentiment classifiers, we compare the difference between stigmatized condition and non-stigmatized conditions. And based on the result, we can see that downstream sentiment classifier tend to classify sentences that include stigmatized conditions as negative, and is more often than when sentences include non-stigmatized conditions. We also have detailed sentiment classification result for each condition in our paper. If anybody is interested, I strongly recommend for individuals to look into the results. So in summary, the results in our research suggest that there is bias against these 93 social stigmatized groups in current US society. However, we also encourage future work to look into whether similar bias exists in AI algorithms and generative systems. Thank you for your attention and time, and I appreciate any comments and questions, and please feel free to reach out after the talk. Thank you.
Okay, actually, thank you. That was great. Actually, can I ask all of our presenters to join us on this dais here? We have actually a little bit more time than because thank you for some of you for not. And so yes, if you have questions, please line up in front of the microphone. And we have actually a fair amount of time. The next session doesn't start until 3:45. Officially, this session ends at in 7 minutes, but we can go a little bit over if you need to go, but feel free to. If you could please also introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah, is this on? Hi, I'm Gabe Schoenbach. I'm a PhD student at the University of Chicago. And I have a question about the Dashcam project. I was wondering about other possible ways to get deployment data, and was wondering if that's something that is possible to get through like FOIA, like Freedom of Information Act requests. And if so, like if you've thought about ways to like validate the like predictions you've been doing against that sort of data.
Yeah, I think if that was deployment data was something released by, like in our case specifically with the NYPD, that was not something they were eager to release. I'm not sure if Freedom of Information would promote them to release that, but that would definitely be a super easy way to like ground truth our results. So.
Hi, Michael Medeo. Thank you all for the really fascinating talks. This is a question for Renja. And for the cross-institutional transfer learning, I'm curious if you have thoughts on to what extent the nature of those institutions might impact the ability to effectively transfer, and if you've looked into to what extent a context or different types of institutions have an effect on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, in our current study, we're focusing on variations within the same type of institution, which where all the institutions we have are 4-year public institutions. So you have this within group variation. So next step, we're working with other types of institutions like community colleges, where the entire context is different. The students are totally different. Their like motivation for attending school is very different. So that's our next step.
Hi, another question for you, Aaron Horowitz. In the educational setting, I imagine the use case for these types of models is sort of interventions for if like there's an expected dropout case. And so I was wondering if you looked at any other metrics besides AUC for that, with the sort of expectation that there might be differences if, say, you only care about like the top 5 or top 10% of students you're worried about dropping out.
Right. As an initial step, we look at AUC, but after this, we realize that AUC is not the most like practical, meaningful metric. It's like for machine learning people, yes, this is something like technical, meaningful. But when we think about practice, right, like when it comes to people using these kind of predictive probabilities or predictions for certain things, we might care about, for example, what's the proportion of students who actually drop out are identified, right? That makes more sense for practitioners to take action. So in our future work, we'll visit these kind of more practical and meaningful and tie it to the specific use case. And even like, for example, cost of actions, cost of interventions, something like that, that's really important, right? So for practitioners.
Okay, do we have any questions from the hop-in? Okay, no. If you're on the hop-in watching, feel free to submit to the Q&A. But no. I was asking, do we have any online questions? But no. Feel free.
Thank you. I have another question about the police deployments piece. I thought that use of rideshare dashcam was a really interesting use of that data. I'm just curious about whether there were other data sources that you explored that you felt may also be useful to this particular case and why you might not have chosen those ones. And then a second part of that question, just curious where else you imagine that research or this sort of line of question to go if you are considering it.
So firstly, with like alternative data sources, we did look at the New York City Department of Transportation, which has mounted cameras above several intersections throughout mostly Manhattan, but also some of the outer boroughs. And this actually popped up during the George Floyd protests as well, where they would find somebody had started basically a web scraper to save all of these images. And they found some pretty weird things. I'll leave that for activistic articles. But basically, that information is not easily accessible, and it's also pretty low res. So the Nexstar data set, the temporal density and the geospatial density we have is much higher, and it allows us to kind of create the much more rich picture than we'd have with Department of Transportation. And as for future work, specifically with the policing, I'm interested in replicating the analysis with more granular racial groupings, because I think specifically in New York City, you cannot capture the whole picture with just doing the 4 major census, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic. And then also, like I said, street side garbage detection and potentially accessibility projects as well. So.
Thank you.
I might also take the chair. Oh yeah, feel free to. But I'll also ask, that this is on measurement in the wild. Then you've all kind of delved into a particular, area, context, specific. And FACT publishes a lot of, we do a lot of theoretical work. But I'm curious if any of you want to sort of reflect on, gaining that kind of specific context-specific, domain-specific expertise in order to do that kind of work. Okay.
At FACT, it's constantly talking about social context, right, as part of the work. So yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's as much as the work on theory, right, is important, there is really the practical aspect in all these case studies, right, that kind of really brings it to life. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Abhishek Sharma. My question is for Sorel. So, to restrict, voting, there are other strategies, right? Like hours and weekends and early voting. So I look forward to reading your paper, but my question was that, does the kind of data that we have accessible, does it allow us to do studies that would tease out the effects?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of things that this study just does not do, right? So, I think, as I sort of mentioned at the top, we tried to look at what is the sort of load of a polling location, right? How many people are assigned there to vote? We were hoping that would turn out to be a useful sort of proxy for wait time. I'm not totally convinced that we got there, right? There's some other, recent nice work on using cell phone data to try to determine, actually tracking how long people were at their polling location, and so how long did they actually have to wait. I think that's a more useful measurement, frankly, than the one we put forward in the paper for that particular piece of it. Because we were working sort of state by state, right, generally the rules about voting are consistent across the state, though that is not always the case. But yeah, I don't think that the data that we collected allows us to tease out that question, and I think that that there are some more sort of on-the-ground things that would need to be done, sort of like that cell phone data question, but one of the questions that we came up against when we were sort of thinking about polling location load was also how many people are working at the polling location, how many machines do they have access to, do all of the machines work, how many people are being asked to show their ID, right? All of those other factors that just aren't sort of geospatial and in voting world data.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is for Caitlin. So I wanted to ask if you consider the effects of implicit bias. Because all the bias that is associated in the work that you've done seemed like they were because of the mentions of the specific stigmatized group. But I was wondering if this is the explicit bias, and if you're thinking about association of these words with other words, that would be implicit bias. Have you considered effects of implicit bias on stigmatized groups?
I think that's a great question to explore next. But I think what I really want to do in this project was to bring light on the bias against social stigmatized groups in a way that it took me some time to figure out how to make the right research design to figure out whether there exists this kind of negative or positive attitude towards this group. And I think implicit bias is something very hard to measure. Even though we have like a lot of word embeddings could be used to measure association directly, but I do feel there is a little challenges here is a lot of words that relate to social stigmas, they're very different. They are not just like one word or two words. Sometimes it's multiple words together make it into a stigmatized group. So I think that, which is why the prompting approach was used so that we can take into account about all these information, which is kind of wild in some way to measure. Yeah, but I think this is a great point to maybe to think about how is these groups are actually, with the limited methods we have to see other bias association in the models and next step in terms of like even applications. Yeah, and I think that's something to worth exploring.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Hi, Crystal Hanty. This is also a question for Caitlin. My question is, I think your methodology in identifying these social stigmas was really strong. I'm curious if you've given any thought to, could you adapt this to try to identify sort of training examples that support these social stigmas and use that as like a filtrate signal to try to suppress some of these? Do you have any thoughts as to how that process could happen?
If I understand it correctly, we are talking about potentially bias mitigation strategy in training data. One thing that is very interesting about social stigma is that there are groups that are quite prominently we have a negative impression. For example, there are groups like people who used to be prisoned and now in parole, and people who are potentially used to be sex offender, and these are a lot of like associations that we human have, and in a way that just is a socially impression that we all felt in society. And I think it's really hard to mitigate any signal related to this kind of like social stigma, because I feel like it's not just something like black or white. Like if it's not something that we can say, oh, if there's negative association with this group in the models, that means this is problematic. Because I feel like there are a lot of times it's very natural to associate danger like with different type of like cases. When it comes down to people who committed crime, then it's hard to say, do we want to completely remove that kind of signal when we are making decisions? Not to say I don't think I have enough thought on how to do this, especially when I was doing this project. I feel like, okay, I'm saying this is so hard to say what's next, like but I do want to bring to light, this is something exists, and I think this is the first step we can do with these kind of algorithms.
All right, well, join me in giving a well-deserved round of applause to 5 wonderful papers. All right, our next session begins at 3:45. Thank you.